Welcome to another virtual talk. This is cutting apart the diegetic interface of Hardspace Shipbreaker. I am Vidhi, a game and UX designer from Vancouver, Canada, and I'm currently working at Blackbird Interactive. I've been with the studio for over 2 years now, and in my time, I have worked on a couple of different projects. The first one being Minecraft Earth. On that project, I was a UX designer, and currently I work on Hardspace Shipbreaker as a game and UX designer. Today, I'll be talking about Hardspace Shipbreaker's recent UI redesign and how we made a decision on our design approach and how we landed on it. I'll talk about our approach's application on a handful of screens, the HUD, the death experience, and the Habitation Module. I'll also discuss the challenges faced and finally the learning outcomes in the game and from this experience. For those who don't know, Hardspace Shipbreaker is an award-winning physics game where you play as a blue-collar worker in space, where you're cutting apart and salvaging ships, all while being in zero-G. We're a fairly small team of about 30 people and have been in early access for over a year now, and that's how long I have been on this project. Like everyone on the team, I too have to wear multiple hats. And I've been a part of the game's design in a handful of different disciplines: UX, game, and narrative design. This game is one of the first of its kind, and it has carved its own genre, so let's look at the game.
My name is Weaver. I'll be your eyes and ears when you're in the yard. Used to be a cutter myself until there were some complications. Let's get to work.
So narratively, this game is set in the future where Earth is in a pretty bad shape and humans have terraformed and moved over to other planets. Since you can't quite afford a ticket to safer planets, you take on this job with Lynx, which is an evil corporation. You take on a job as the salvager or cutter, and it comes with a hefty debt. So with each ship that you salvage, you essentially pay off your debt. Now, of course, there's endless fines and fees that you have to pay to live, and they just kind of keep piling up. But I mean, what else do you expect from an evil company that's all about capitalism and profits? So let's get into the game. When you begin the game, the first thing a player experiences is this contract screen. It's perhaps one of my favorite experiences in the game. Similar to forms that you may have filled in your life, you're filling out another corporate, bone-dry piece of paperwork. Set in this cold, damp-looking room, you sign your life away. You never really read the terms and conditions. You look at your food options, they're all quite dismal. But this interaction immediately sets the tone for the rest of the game world, which is it's dark, it's corporate, and it's so real that it kind of hurts. So this experience became the template or the standard of the experience that we wanted to apply to the rest of the screens in the game, which in the form when I joined the team wasn't the case. So while preparing for the redesign, the first thing we had to identify were the constraints. The first one is short timelines. Since we are in early access, our release cycles range anywhere between 1 to 3 months, which is not a whole lot of time to make large changes while you're also making changes to other facets of the game, like tools, ship, and tech. So we had limited dev time when we were looking at the UI redesign. We also had limited design time. I was the only person kind of in charge of this revamp, and I was also in charge of other things in the game. just like everybody else on this team. So we had to be strategic with how we approach this redesign and how much time and effort and resources we could put behind it. Now, the game is set in a pretty interesting and expansive world, as I just kind of mentioned before. But with our releases, we're introducing the story and other characters into this world. And we're doing this mostly through talking heads or very text-heavy messages that players receive in the game. And this is because of our limited resources. We don't have a budget for cutscenes, QuickTime events, 3D modeled characters that could potentially be animated. So we realized that the UI would have to do a lot of the world building heavy lifting. And that led to the challenge. How do we add depth to the story through the game's UI? We wanted to not only redesign the interface to make it more usable. It was very much, made by devs in the past, but we wanted to make the experience more immersive and embedded into the game world. We wanted to build a mental space for the player, for this company that they're working for, and the world that this game is set in, all through the game's UI. So that's the kind of the point of this talk, is to show how you can accomplish, or what you can accomplish when user experience design, game design, and narrative collaborate from the very beginning to find inexpensive solutions to building a game world. In our case, this was purely an outcome of necessity because of our limited resources, as I just mentioned, but it helped us understand and finalize our approach, which is a mostly diegetic approach to the game UI. And I'll kind of expand on that throughout the talk. But what we really wanted to do was use every screen in the game or every opportunity in the game to build a sense of presence for the player and make it more immersive. Now, I might interchange between those two terms, game presence and immersion, but this is what I'm really referring to. For those who don't know, diegetic is a term used across media, and what it really means is an element that exists both for the audience or the player as well as the characters within the world. It's one of the 4 types of UI in games, and we heavily leaned upon this UI style. So from the example before, the contract screen is not just a 2D UI element, but it's rather contextually and physically placed in the game world where both you as the player and the character in the game world interact with this interface. We identified 4 pillars that we wanted to take or hit with our design approach. First one being information architecture. This game is very information dense and all mostly condensed into a single screen, and it often became a point of contention for our players. So we wanted to ensure we built a clear hierarchy. We wanted to make large amounts of information digestible. The second being gameplay. So we wanted to use these screens to direct players to complete or hit design goals in the game. As the game has developed, so have the goals within the game. So we had to work as a unit, all designers together, to identify these new goals and how we can guide the players to those goals through the UI. Usability, bit of a no-brainer as someone who is looking at interfaces day in, day out. We obviously wanted to hit some of the basics, readability, usability, navigation. But this is really not a usability talk, and I don't want to focus on that. What I really want to talk about is integrating that last element of the story and the narrative in. What we really wanted to do was build game presence through the game's interface. And that's the approach, and that's the real point of this talk today. Now, to take this approach, 2 sections of design had to work together, one impacting the other and vice versa. Oftentimes, there are 2 separate factions in a studio, and they don't get to be so closely integrated. So I thought I would be very much like the Spider-Man, pulling these 2 ends together. I'm so cool, I'm so smart and strong. But in reality, that's kind of what my experience was mostly like. I definitely felt like that cat. And I especially felt like this cat when we were addressing the densest screen of our game. And that screen, is the HUD. So before I show you what we got to, where we are today, let's look at the very first HUD of the game, because this HUD set the seed for the rest of the experiences. So what you're seeing here is the first prototype of the game. It was an outcome of a game jam in this within the studio. What you're seeing on this HUD is something that's truly diegetic. As the player's head moves around, the camera moves to mimic your head shaking or your head moving around. And I'll kind of play this again for you to see. Of course, it's a little janky, it's a prototype, but theoretically it's very cool, it's very novel, but it definitely has some obvious usability concerns. You have UI components being cut off, you have text kind of being burnt at the edges, and this would be considered a truly diegetic approach, right? Something that is the suit that is on the helmet of the suit of the cutter, it's on that glass and it's kind of displayed onto this glass. So as much as we walked away from this concept because of usability reasons and the amount of information we'll have to show, this seed was set pretty early on. It had to be a helmet, and it had to be displayed on that glass. This is the HUD that the game launched with. It is not the HUD that you have in the game today. What you're seeing is you in the bay. This is where majority of the gameplay takes place. You're holding a grapple, or you'd be holding another tool, and you begin cutting, or you begin salvaging. The HUD is still a display on the helmet, but it's less responsive to movement, as we just saw in the example before. The biggest difference between these two screens, and of course the styling differences in a whole lot, but the main thing I want you to focus on is the amount of information packed onto this screen in a single interface. And I want to walk you through the 4 pillars that we had and how we address them in this HUD. But first, let's look at all the information on the screen. So in this situation, you're inside of a ship and you're cutting, and the biggest UI element you're seeing is this work order. It tells the player what they need to salvage when they're in a particular shift. And it takes majority of your screen space. Here you're seeing your tool information displayed in 4 vastly different locations, even though it all pertains to the single tool that you have in your hand. The temperature, the durability, the ability to navigate to other tools, and on the top left, you're seeing the tether count, or it would be the demo charge count, depending on the tool in your hand. But to see information about a single object, a player would have to look kind of all the way around the screen to gather that information. Not particularly ideal. Here you see highlighted your stats, your oxygen meter, and the timer in of your shift. Some of these elements need to be replenished multiple times within a shift, so they're quite vital and important for a player to look at when it comes to moment-to-moment gameplay. And questionably, some of the more important UI components are these 2, where you have your object information and where a salvage item goes, and the pressurization state of a room. That's important. If you begin cutting in a pressurized room, you will blow up and die. So don't do that. Not good. And the last thing I want to kind of bring focus to here is the subtitles. You'll see them overlaid on top of other UI elements, making neither the UI elements nor the subtitles particularly legible. What I haven't even done here is highlight the notifications, the hazard warnings, and other UI elements that appear on the screen from time to time. But the idea I'm trying to kind of convey across is that there's a lot of information on this one screen, and it is scattered, and there is no clear hierarchy. So this is the new HUD. Visually, a whole lot less cluttered, but let's break this down. These are the 2 HUDs side by side for you to see the major differences at the first glance. So let's go through the 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier and how they impact the redesign. The first one being information hierarchy, or information architecture, sorry. We laid out every single UI element that had to be displayed onto the screen and identified what is the most important information that will impact the player from moment to moment in the gameplay, and find an optimal position to place that on the screen. So you wanted to reduce any clutter that could be where the player is cutting or looking at the ship. And we wanted to keep those core pieces of UI bits of information, so your tool info, object info, talking heads, and your stats close to that center, so close to the bottom center, reducing the cognitive load for the player. It's the central cutting zone, if you will, and all kind of grouped together in the center and the bottom center of the screen. We use this screen. This is just another example of the same new HUD, just to show other elements that appear on the screen from time to time. We wanted to use the screen to train the players to build a muscle and visual memory. So if something flashes on the left, you're getting a notification. So that's a part of your feedback loop. If something flashes on your right, there's going to be your hazards, and you'll see an example of that moving forward. We've reclaimed real estate by moving the tool information into one succinct location and introducing a radial menu, condensing the swapping between tools into one spot that is hidden off the screen. Several usability concerns have already kind of been addressed through this, but the one I want to bring your focus to, because this is not a usability talk, as I mentioned earlier, but the one component I wanted to bring your focus to as a primary example is the talking head. As we build this game out, we're adding new characters in the game. So for players who may have turned their audio off, and that does hurt our audio team, it hurts their heart. But for players who may have turned their audio off, or players who may have visual or hearing impairments, we have ensured no UI elements overlap each other. We've also added the player or the character's portrait, and we've reduced or removed any post effects from the talking head to ensure that that is particularly legible at any given point in the game. Now, I do want to say an accessibility pass has not been done for this game yet, but is planned and in the works. To hit the design goal pillar, or the gameplay goal pillar, I mentioned the work order, the big UI component on the screen. Not only did it take a lot of real estate, it held the player's hand and told the player what they had to do on every ship, even though that wasn't truly the case. It added to a quota system, but it narrowed the player's focus. So while working with other designers in the team, we moved away from a work order to a salvage bar, which told the player how much of the ship they had salvaged and how much they had destroyed, incentivizing not just salvaging the entire ship, but incentivizing a sense of exploration, which is something that was kind of missing from previously from the screen. So we used the UI to add that sense of exploration, but that did mean, or it came at a cost of retuning and reworking the progression and the economy, which was spearheaded by another designer on the team, Jason Barth. This is a particularly big feat, and could honestly warrant an entire talk of its own, but I'm not going to focus on that. Luckily, we are in early access, so we have access to players through our Discord, Twitch, Twitter that get to give us feedback, and we get to see the impact of some of these decisions as we're making them. So the goal for this interface was to make it as realistic as possible and embed it into the game world. We were heavily inspired by fighter pilot jets, and we wanted to use those as an example to build a sense of expertise, that when a fighter pilot looks at this, they know what they're looking at, but a layman wouldn't. So how do we condense information, tell the player that they're an expert, but also explain it to them in case they ever get lost? So we tried to build that emotion of an expert, of the fact that this is displayed onto your helmet through the effects in the game. So I'll give you an example here. Narratively, Lynx doesn't give you the nice fancy tech. That's reserved for the upper class. But rather what you get is the retrofitted hand-me-down tech called Trevorware tech in the game, named after one of our great devs in the team. So here's an example of your HUD kind of reacting to the external forces when you are cutting the ship. Really embracing the fact that this screen is on your helmet. It is not modern technology. And if you take damage, so does your helmet, so does your suit. We've also added stylized elements like brackets and acronyms to bring the player closer to the fighter pilot feel. Now there are elements on this HUD that are not truly diegetic, and I'm going to address that now. We've crossed bounds of the glass from time to time. But this, and there's UI elements that probably wouldn't exist, and for sure would not exist on a fighter pilot HUD. But this was a conscious decision that we made to ensure that we made room for every element in the game. And we tried to bring the player back into that sense of presence using the post effects and audio, as you saw in this slide before, to set that or to sell that realism. Those things become particularly apparent when a player comes closer to death. And honestly, speaking of death, there are many ways to die in this game. Death is a big part of this game, actually. And that became the second focus. It's another golden opportunity that we found to apply the same approach, the 4-pillar approach, to the death experience. That's what we're going to talk about next. What a segue, almost like I planned it. So, narratively, when you die, and honestly, there's many ways to die in this game, Lynx takes your genetic sequence and they clone you. And as it turns out, to this corporation, cloning is much cheaper than surgery, recovery, antibiotics, I don't know. So we needed the players to really feel and understand that they're disposable. They are expendable in the eyes of this evil company that they're working for. And this is the version of the death screen that the game launched with. What you're seeing here is the screen fading to black, text with letting and kerning problems for the UI-minded folk, I am aware. This text appearing on the screen, telling you how you died, a demerit that's been added, and a funny quip. But it didn't really do it justice, and it didn't really sell that emotion of, oh, I'm pretty expendable to this company. So this is the new death experience. You've died of asphyxiation, and what you see now is being completely cloned. What you're hearing is your guts completely being moved and your genetic sequence being stored and rebuilt, to really sell the sense of you're not even you anymore. And we use the metaphor of a real-life health and safety work report akin to the contract screen that you saw before, to tell the player how they died, what they can do to improve this gameplay, and we've kept the funny quip and the finger stamp, because your identity is kind of tied to that. This not only paved the way for a more interesting death experience that added no more than 10 seconds to the gameplay and got the player back into the game as soon as they finish, but it influenced the onboarding experience, which is something that kind of came in last minute because the death experience already existed. Where what you see now, and this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, so if you want to experience this, look away, you get brutally killed in the first few minutes of the game, where the company takes a genetic sequence, it stores you, and then rebuilds you from the ground up. The sounds are pretty cool.
Thank you. Beginning spare generation.
Along with this, at the end of the sequence, is a list of all the fees that are now added onto your charge when you begin working for this company. So that's how we impacted the death experience, but that's not all. The last thing I want to show you is the Habitation Module, or the HAB. In our latest update, we've redesigned this. We've called it the Employee Terminal. But what this is it's your home. This is where players can take a break from cutting, when they can upgrade their equipment, see messages, look at data drives, see their progress. And we often use the screen to move the story forward, where you have characters talk to each other. So Traditionally, and this is what the game launched with, is a 2D utilitarian interface with what looks like an image in the background of what the hab could potentially be, interfering with the text and with the interfaces as you navigate through them all. So this is the latest update. It involves an entirely new hab. It represents a monitor or a terminal that you're interacting with using the same Trevorware tech. We've addressed the visual styles, the fonts for readability. The user flows have been updated for a handful of these submenus. But most importantly, we wanted to embrace that concept of real-world metaphors to enhance this immersion. An example of this is the data miner screen. So thematically, this is a piece of rogue software that you've been given, and we wanted the player to feel like they're doing something they probably shouldn't have. It's a combination of stylized UI, post effects, and audio to sell this. But we're not stopping here. In our latest update, we've got the 2D UI, but we have plans of taking this even further. Like the fan art we often receive about the three-dimensional hab, what we're working towards is a three-dimensional hab where players can go and interact with monitors. Again, most akin to that contract screen. But for now, that's classified. So, to recap, there's a lot to recap. With every screen you've seen here, and for the screens we intend on working on in the future, we have taken this approach. We've tried to hit these 4 pillars to build not just usable interfaces, but rather add a sense of story into the game world and a sense of presence in an inexpensive manner. This wasn't easy, and that there were challenges. The first one is I'm emotionally attached to everything, so can you please change it, but also maybe don't. The game's been in development for over 5 years, and players have had it in their hands for over a year now, which means there's a lot of emotional attachment and a lot of biases already formed. So to introduce design changes meant having to work within a predefined box, but having to ground every decision that we made in UX theory or in design theory to be able to really sell it, because people are invested and have to be okay with a little bit of pushback. Because we're in early access and because of our limited budget, we don't really do a lot of user testing. Early access is good. You get a lot of direct contact with players, but what you're not getting is a formalized method of collecting information and feedback. I would highly recommend for you or for anybody to push user testing onto their project as soon as possible. We have now begun formalizing user testing sessions on a weekly basis with the team. And it's still a biased method, but it's a step in the right direction. But it has been a pretty big challenge that I've had to face. The last one is data turnaround time. We do collect telemetry, but by the time we have a release, the telemetry data becomes kind of substantial. We're knee-deep into prepping the next release, and the one after that has already been mapped out. What this means, and this late into early access, what this means is we have to negotiate with our producers what goes in and what doesn't, and where something's going to get compromised. So Jessica Klein, our executive producer, gave a talk this morning where she talks about this one-in, one-out concept, where you if you're going to address a new task, you're going to add a new task, you're going to have to take that time away from somewhere else. And this meant a balancing act, and to have to really think both granularly and holistically when making this decision. Some of the learnings and opportunities from this experience. UX and games worked closely together. They sat at the exact same table. And I kind of rarely, but no, I did feel like Spider-Man. Having both in the same room at the same time meant influencing the game holistically and not in silo. I have worked on games where I've had to be in one department or the other, but having the ability to leverage all components, the game, the story, and user experience design, what you're really doing is building emotion for players, and that's incredibly valuable. Especially with the constraints that I mentioned earlier, this became an inexpensive and innovative way, I guess, to introduce story and to build that presence into the game through the game's UI. We leveraged not just UI, but also effects and audio, and I understood that value very strongly through this experience. It was just plain fun. I don't know what to tell you. I've worked in both departments separately, but this was an incredibly fulfilling experience as a creative. And now I find myself thinking always holistically. I can't make a design decision purely without considering the UX implications or vice versa. And I think that has helped me become a better designer, but it's also helped impact the game in a positive manner. And this also builds an opportunity for this game to build that world, to potentially even build a franchise if they ever chose to. It's really building a canvas for this game and the future. The UI becomes a part of the world that players now expect when they see this game. So this has been our approach to the game's UI. Hopefully, you can find this useful for your project in building experiential design, especially for smaller teams. Thank you so much for your time, and don't forget, death is a fresh start. Feel free to contact me. I'll be here for a Q&A session. Thank you so much.